Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our Grow Native webinar. It's 10 Steps to Moving Beyond Monarchs with Paula Diaz. The Grow Native program is a native plant marketing and education program that serves the lower Midwest, run by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. My name is Brooke Widmar, and I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I also want to recognize and thank our Grow Native sponsors listed here on the screen. Their support makes native plant educational opportunities like this one possible. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And at the end, Carol will come on and read those out. The webinar is being recorded. The link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with any resources mentioned during the presentation and the Q&A session. So to introduce today's speaker, Paula Diaz is the principal of GardeNerd Consultations, helping incorporate native plants into traditional home and business landscapes. Paula is a master gardener and also a master communicator, publishing articles, teaching classes, and giving talks about native plant gardening. Her passion is to create spaces which are ecologically beneficial and to share with others the joy of welcoming nature into human spaces. So without further ado, take it away, Paula.
Thank you, Brooke. Lest anyone should think that because this is titled 10 Steps to Moving Beyond Monarchs, that I somehow do not love monarchs. That is not the case. I do love monarchs. You can see the milkweed seed pods artwork behind me. I have on my monarch earrings. So this is not to say that monarchs shouldn't be loved, but that we will also learn to love additional things besides the gateway bug of the monarchs that we start off with, so many of us. I mean, I know that happened for me. The first way that I started to learn about native plants was hearing about the monarchs and thinking, oh, milkweed. And then, you know, so many people don't even know how many different kinds of milkweed there are. They think there's only the one. But one of the very first things that I want to shoot for is don't be afraid of all the other insects. I've always said that Winnie the Pooh has a lot to answer for. In his stories, he's after honeybees who have honey and he wants the honey, and those bees chase him until he jumps in a lake. Well, most of our native bees, honeybees are from Europe, they're an import. Most of our native bees live solitary lives. Some of them, like the bumblebees, will form colonies. And then there's, you know, all different kinds of insects. But here's an example right here. And I wish I had the technological skills to have been able to share the video I took of this with you. But this is one of those little bee houses. There's different perspectives on, are they good? Are they bad? Do they create a location where a predator can destroy a whole ton of eggs all at once? Or does a parasite get in there and parasitize every single cell that's in there? But this has been sitting on my deck for, I don't even know how many years, several years. And all of a sudden I was outside one day and I was like, look at all these bees, what's going on this spring? And so these photos were taken with my adorable granddaughter, whom you will see later on because I have to always include her, sitting right there on the deck railing with me. And we were talking about how bees are friends, and these bees did not care one iota that we were sitting there watching them go into the tubes and lay an egg and provide pollen and nectar and whatever else types of food sources that they put in there for that egg, and then seal it up with mud because these are mason bees, and then make another cell and do the same thing over and over again, laying the eggs at the furthest back of those tubes, the female eggs, and then further towards the front, they lay the male eggs because, you know, you really only need one male to survive and all those females can be taken care of, but the females are really much more precious, as they should be. But anyway, these bees, they don't care what we're doing. Right below there, where they were just dive bombing down from the deck railing to this area, it's all these things that we now have labeled with the scarlet letter W, and we now call them weeds, even though they're beautiful violets. And I don't have to mow where those grow because it doesn't matter. There's no grass that gets tall, so I don't have to mow them. And these bees were dive bombing into these violets that were blooming, coming up and making their little egg cells and continuing and continuing and continuing. And they did this for probably about a week, that there was just this unbelievable activity of all these different bees going in there. And we just got to remember that there's all kinds of bees, and honeybees might have a group home to protect. These guys just happen to create a group home because I provided that spot for them. They don't traditionally live in a group like that. Another thing that I think sometimes we neglect to think about is, when is the best time to get out and see all of these different insects that we've attracted, and other creatures, not just the insects, but I'm kind of focusing mostly on the insects today just because there's so many things to focus on. So this photograph I took at the very early morning, when all these little critters were snuggled down in that tulip tree blossom, and they had spent the night in there for protection. They all cohabitated. They didn't eat each other, obviously. Maybe they will now that they're awake. This first slide, I took that photo when there was a big storm heading in, and that was the evening that that storm was coming in. And then probably you can see it because I can't see it behind the little screen thingy. There's a little tree frog right here. And we found that the other morning when I went outside with my granddaughter. She had to gear herself up with her pink purse and one pink mitten and her shoes to go look at it, because she was a little wary, but she wasn't afraid. She learned that these are some really cool things. And so easiest time to see these things is earlier in the morning and later in the evening. Sometimes in the morning, you'll even find a big fat bumblebee inside of a blossom that they spent the night in, and you can pet them. If it's a nice cool morning, they don't mind. Be gentle, of course. And the other bookends for us to think about are the bookends of the seasons. Typically, we don't see a whole ton of insect activity in Missouri in the wintertime, but early spring, this would be aromatic sumac. And then in the fall, we need to remember those asters and goldenrods to support those other creatures in addition to the monarchs. We're not dissing the monarchs, I promise, but these other creatures also need some love. Step 3, size does not matter. Some of these insects and other pollinators are so dang tiny, it's hard to see them. So you really got to get in there, and don't be afraid to get in there. I'm in those plants all the time, whether I'm cutting some for a bouquet or weeding out whatever else has jumped in there or whatever it might be, taking photographs. They're not going to attack you. They really don't care what we are doing as long as they are eating. These little tiny ants are inside of a Missouri primrose blossom, so we know how small that bloom is. These are probably about the size of an aster blossom. They're really small. And then this is American basket flower, which is one that I have started from seed in my yard. And it's one that's really fun to be a photo hangout spot because a lot of different ones like to come through there. But these guys are really teeny tiny, and yet they're still important in our ecosystem. They still have a job to do, and they're still out there pollinating all these little flowers. And then we have the big guys over here. This is a big fat bumblebee. You can see his brown spot on his shoulders, which helps us identify him as a bumblebee. That's a shrubby St. John's wort blossom. So you can see how much bigger he is than the blossom itself. And these guys just are frantic when the shrubby St. John's wort shrubs are blooming. Some blossoms, they just kind of slowly meander around and get their stuff. On the shrubby St. John's wort, these guys are like on crack. They are just going zooming all constantly. And it's really hard to get a photograph. As you can see, that's not terribly clear, but that's because they never stop moving. This big guy on some sedum is not, in fact, a bee. Look at that hairy behind on there, and look at the way his wings are attached. This is a fly, which mimics a bee. So you look at it and you think, that looks like a bumblebee and a fly had a baby. That's pretty much what it is. It's a mimic. It's a fly that pretends to look like a bumblebee for protection. And then here's another little teeny tiny little bee that we can see. I think he's a bee. I haven't ID'd all of these, I'll tell you the truth. But you can see that he's got the nice stripes and he's got these little tiny wings. So he's a really cutie. Step 4, provide a smorgasbord for all of these creatures that need some food. As much as possible, we need to think about native plantings, not just as one plant here and one plant there. We need to think about them as right in this space, we have a plant that will bloom spring, then right next to it or touching it or behind it, we've got a plant that will bloom later in the spring and then early summer and midsummer and late summer and fall. And so we get even more plants crammed into our beds. They may start off looking like this with this much space because we've got little tiny baby plants in there. But eventually they're going to fill in and we're going to have things that bloom in a sequence. So early spring, we've got these awesome Pachyra obovata. What do they call it now? I'm trying to think. They changed it because it was an inappropriate terminology. Round leaf groundsel. Sorry, it's been a long several months. Anyway, round leaf groundsel. So that's one of our earliest bloomers. And that's a great one for your shade. Then you've got the Virginia. Oh my gosh, my brain is not working. Wild ginger. Where did I come up with Virginia? Anyway, wild ginger. Sorry, folks. And then in here, we've got some liatris that'll bloom earlier. Then we've got some liatris that'll bloom later. Then we've got some purple poppy mallow. And there is rattlesnake master. And there are, I don't even remember what all's in this bed. But look for that sequence. Provide a whole huge amount, as much space as you can have. This particular bed right here, these plants are all touching now, which is what plants are supposed to do. This bed is, if you're familiar with the Kansas City area, it's in Johnson County. It faces onto a main drag street. You can see this sign here. The gentleman that does the gardening here is a retired engineer. And so he has found ways to create these gorgeous signs for his plants to let people know exactly what their purpose is. But plants should touch each other. We want to have as many different types of food sources in any given space as we can. It's not going to look the same as it used to, but that's okay. Here's one that provides some really terrific nutrients at all different times of the year, and it's really cool looking as well. This is elderberry. It, as you can see, disguises a rain barrel from most views. Then when these things are blooming, oh my gosh, you can't even count the numbers of insects that are all over those blossoms, and they smell wonderful. So if you've got the space for something that's going to be large, this is not a small little shrub to put in front of the house unless that's what you want it to be. But this is going to be a large one. But elderberry is terrific. And then, of course, it makes these beautiful berries. And I even cut the berries, not just the blossoms, but also the berries to use in bouquets, because even the structure, once the berries have been eaten, because the birds will be all over that as well as every other creature that can find them. Even the structure that it leaves behind is really interesting looking in a bouquet. So why only have the blooms? You can also use the berries, and a lot of people consume them, humans consume them, syrups and concoctions and teas and all different things that people make from those berries now and previously did. And then one thing we kind of forget about sometimes too is to provide the oak trees. These big old bur oak acorns are wonderful food for all the 450,000 million zillion squirrels that live in our yard. But in addition to that, there's all kinds of creatures that eat oak trees that are insects. These tulip trees, you saw one of those earlier with so many insects in one blossom. Just imagine how many insects are utilizing this tree. It's massive. In fact, there's 2 tulip trees, and that was why we bought the place that we bought, because we figured we can change the house. It's just a thing, but we could never grow mature trees like this property had. So just imagine all of the insects when you multiply the blossoms by that. In addition, this is my signature look that I watch for that to start blooming, and that tells me it's time to put out the food, the oranges and grapes for the Baltimore Orioles as they go through, because it's always right when these begin to open up with these orange throats and delicious nectar that the Baltimore Orioles show up. These little dudes are hickory tussock moth caterpillars. I have a baby little hickory tree, and they consumed every single leaf on that tree, but you know what? It came right back. It had no problem just coming right back. And no, I didn't do anything to eliminate these guys. They were funny looking and cute. It actually looked kind of like the whole tree itself was a little fuzzy. And then we've got hawthorn trees down here. The thorns are a little bit annoying, but they're not something that's really dramatic like you would see on a locust tree or something of that nature. It's got beautiful blooms in the springtime, and then these berries are delicious for the birds as the winter goes on. Step 5, nobody is perfect. Whether you're doing traditional gardening or whether you're doing native plant gardening. There's never going to be a perfect everything in your entire garden. So learn to welcome these things as symbols that you are providing something to some other creature. These are galls that, if I'm remembering right, those were on the serviceberry trees. And that would mean that there's little insects inside of there and little woodpeckers that are going to go and try to eat those little insects inside of there. So I don't see those and go, oh my gosh, what spray do I grab to fix that problem? I say, look what Mother Nature did this time. And a lot of people get really freaked out when their monarch milkweed gets aphids on it. If it really, really, really makes you think that that plant is going to be totally destroyed, take your fingers, and I use a glove because I think it's gross, and just squish some of them. Not all of them, because those are food for ladybugs. So there's always a purpose for everything that we have been trained to think of as an imperfection. To me, this is not an, this is not an imperfection. It is just a change, a difference. Just like some years one flower is more prominent and some years a different flower is more prominent, just depending upon like how much rain we've gotten or how much rain we have not gotten. Different things thrive every year. So it's not going to be the same every year, no matter what we do. But aphids are somebody else's food. And Mother Nature has provided milkweed for a very long time for the monarchs and for the aphids. And they've all managed to survive until the humans started destroying it all. So we've got to remember that these things serve a purpose too. When I look at this little serviceberry and I see all these holes in these leaves, I think, oh my gosh, I could not cut that perfect circle with a pair of scissors if I tried. And yet these little bees cut these little circles to stuff them in their little tubes to protect their babies and seal off one cell and create another cell. It's just amazing how they can make it the exact right size. I can't measure like that, and I can't cut like that either. These little guys, these are the silvery checker spot caterpillars for the silvery checker spot butterfly. But if you looked at that and you were like, oh my gosh, that's so gross. What do I need to spray my coneflowers with to get rid of all the, oh, look at the leaves. They look terrible. You know what? They're feeding another creature. They're not only for us to look at, they have a purpose. That's why the native plants are spoken of as plants with purpose. They literally have a purpose. They feed other creatures. It's not just for us to look at. One of the hardest things for folks to get past is leaving leaves, leaving the leaf matter, leaving the stems. A lot of people are like, oh my goodness, can I cut down all these stems yet? Because it just looks so messy. Well, dead things are good things in Mother Nature's world. Even if we humans have been taught that we should clean it up, clean it up, clean it up. If you could see the rest of this office, you would know that cleaning is not my favorite thing. These are dead trees in a hedgerow, but quite obviously, they are providing a resource that another creature needs. Woodpeckers, and then other creatures come and use the woodpecker holes. It's amazing to watch how many creatures need these dead things that we think have to be cleaned up. So if you have a spot where a tree has died because it reached the end of its lifetime or a disease or what have you, if it won't fall on your house or your garage or your swimming pool or whatever it might be, if it is not a true danger, then try to leave it. And even if you can't leave the whole entire thing, maybe you could leave like 10 feet of it so that the other creatures could still utilize the rest of that tree. These leaves are where all these little critters spend the winter and hide out from late freezes like we have in Missouri. If these leaves had all been cleaned up when those late freezes hit us, they wouldn't have had anywhere to stay protected. And then there will be those who claim that too many leaves will make your plants not grow. Well, I beg to differ. We have, I can't even remember, I think it's 15 pin oak trees that go around the two sides, and then multiple other oak trees, and I have way too many maple trees this year, way too many baby maples coming up. Those things, I feel like I pull 9 million of them a year. But anyway, the leaves will break down. Can you see this little guy flying right there? Yeah, can you see that this purple poppy mallow came up through all those leaves, even some branches that didn't get picked up? All those leaves. There's even little baby milkweed coming up through all those leaves. So the leaves won't. They may slow the growth, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we change the typical growth rate and size of native plants by treating them like we treated plants that needed more care. So let Mother Nature do the work. She will break it down. It becomes really nice soil, and they will do whatever they need to do to get through it. I like to post a sign so that any neighbors that are walking, they can see that it's not just that this crazy woman hasn't cleaned up her yard because she's so lazy, which I am. I'll admit that I'm a lazy gardener for sure, which is another reason that I love the natives, because they don't need as much from me. If I'm going to be out there, I want to be taking pictures of the creatures and the flowers and the textures. I don't want to have to be dragging a hose to water something when it's July and 120 degrees. So anyway, something like this helps to tell your neighbors that there's a reason for what you're doing. I've seen and have used a meme-ish type of thing that has some Victorian clothed gentleman on it and says, if you don't dress like this, why do you still garden like this? Well, the thing is, back in those times, I'm feeling that's not real accurate, because back in Victorian times, the lawn was not a monoculture. There was all kinds of stuff growing there. And then there would be grazers that typically came to graze it. So it wasn't really the heinous thing that it is now. It wasn't all chemical. It wasn't all mowed within an inch of its life. Literally, oftentimes we forget it's a plant and it actually has to have some body to grow and photosynthesize. But in the 70s, maybe late 60s, that was when we really started being told that you cannot have anything other than a blade of turf grass in your yard. There should be no dandelions, there should be no clover, there should be no violets, there should be no anything that's not Kentucky bluegrass or fescue. I mean, that's pretty much what we were told. So if you don't still have the plastic on your sofas and sitting there on the plastic with your cigarette, because you know that's pretty much not done anymore either. And then if you're not wearing the plaid leisure suits or listening to Donny Osmond music, it's probably time to move forward. How many landscapes like these do you still see going on? I personally see a lot of them. And sometimes you can tell the folks that never use their front door because shrubs like this will have just totally grown over the front door and you would have to fight the shrubs to get to the front door. But this is so boring. Isn't that just the most boring thing to look at? And these photos are taken from the 1970s, folks, and we 50 years later are still doing the same thing. We don't do that anymore. Why do we still do this? And in that same vein, why do we find landscaping that looks like this to be acceptable for so many people to look at? I mean, it's not even just you and your neighbors that have to look at this. This is all the people that come by through this public space. So why couldn't they look at something like this, where there's blooming flowers and all kinds of lovely textures, and it takes less maintenance than that should have? At least they don't have to come back and remulch this all the time. And even think maybe really wild and crazy, what if we let it go and do something like that? And it would keep the parking lot cooler, and it would give the insects a place to live. But we kind of keep living in the past as far as landscaping goes a lot of the time. Now, I raised two boys when they were teenagers, and they were wrestlers, and their buddies would come over, and if you didn't have food, it was going to be an issue. And I loved every minute of that. But just like those teenage boys, if there's food, these creatures are going to come and eat it. We oftentimes think of milkweed only for the monarchs, but guess what? These milkweed tussock moths, they are food for somebody else. They serve a purpose in the ecosystem. And in my experience, when these guys eat every single leaf off of your milkweed, by the time the monarchs start migrating back south, it will have grown back new foliage and you will still have plenty for the monarchs. So don't think of these guys as pests. Think of them as consumers. So they're going to consume what's available right now, and then it's going to grow back, just like if you went to the grocery store, and then the next generation is going to come along and eat all of that too. You know, the bluebirds, they are not going to be seed eaters. You put out mealworms if you're a bird feeder kind of a person. So guess what? They need insects, high protein, soft, squishy food for their babies. The woodpeckers, if they don't have a place to make a home, that's when they start rat-a-tatting on your house. We did have one time a woodpecker that really liked our rain gutter for tapping on early in the morning, but you know, eventually he found somebody that he liked and went and made a nest, and we didn't hear from him anymore. The orioles always show up in my yard when the tulip trees begin to bloom. I don't think that's a coincidence because all these creatures have evolved together for so long. Like these little gumballs that we all hate so much. If you've ever had those in an area where you've got a flat surface that they land on, there's gazillions of little teeny tiny seeds that fall out of those. So all the black-capped chickadees and the finches, all the little birds are after those little tiny seeds. So even though they're annoying as heck, they do serve a purpose other than even the foliage itself being eaten. Rose-breasted grosbeak, they come to the feeder, but that means there's all kinds of seeds like these, as well as all those other seed heads that you've seen in the other photos that are out there for them to consume. Here's our monarch. And what they love to consume as an adult when they're migrating is that liatris blossom. Usually it's either rough or eastern blazing star that's blooming at the time they're migrating back south, and they love it. And here's another little creature you might find on your milkweed and go, oh my gosh, it's not a monarch, so I'm going to kill it. Well, guess what? That's the unexpected cycnia moth on common milkweed. So there are many consumers of milkweed, not just the monarchs. And then here's a little guy that is one of the green tree frogs. He's so cute. So keep your eyes open and you'll see all these creatures that are coming. It won't be just the monarchs. You'll have all these other ones to take care of too. And again, look at all the different kinds of bees that there are in Missouri. They're everywhere, and there's so many different ones, and they're so cool. And there's so many different kinds of butterflies and moths and dragonflies and damselflies. And here's a little guy on the oak tree. Can you see him? He's right there. Cecropia moth. Isn't he so cool? The next thing I recommend to do is to share the love. Once we begin to see all these additional creatures in our yard, share the love. Teach the young ones. That's one of my big things, is harping on, we've got to teach the kids this stuff. They're the ones that can convince their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to do something so that they can see the caterpillars or the butterflies or add this or that plant. And it also means that they're learning something that becomes a lifelong interest. I have yet to show a kid a caterpillar and have them go, oh, okay, that's boring. They might, if they have never been exposed before, have kind of an, ew, what is that kind of thing. But typically it's, oh my gosh, that is so cool. This was, my neighbor sent me this one and they were like, what kind of moth is that? Or what kind of caterpillar is that? Look how huge it is. It's like a hot dog. And yeah, it was a huge caterpillar. And what he does is he buries down in the soil to spend the winter and then comes back out as a moth in the springtime. Here we've got some monarchs. And this little guy thought that if he just was real gentle and held his hand out and he walked towards them, they would come and land on his hand. He was wrong, but he enjoyed the experience anyway. And what kid doesn't love looking for the frass from a caterpillar? I mean, just the fact that they can say that word and it means poop and they don't have to get in trouble for it. It's a good thing. Kind of talked about that sign with the leave the leaves, but let your neighbors know why you're doing things a little differently than what they might have originally thought a garden should look like. It starts a lot of really good conversations too. And also, one thing I do is I go to the thrift store and I buy, or garage sales or whatever, and buy cheapo vases. And so then if I know a neighbor has a special occasion, or just for the heck of it, if their kid comes over, we send them home with a bouquet from the yard too. Those are things that help people start to recognize what's going on there. And even though it's different from what they're used to from the 1970s landscaping with the evergreens or the boxwoods or whatever blob you put up there, it helps them to think differently about what they're seeing that's different. And it doesn't have to be the huge prairie spaces. Would that be absolutely wonderful if every single one of us could plant a huge prairie? Definitely. But it can be something just as small as the bed that runs along your front sidewalk, even in a really nice area, and you end up having a neighbor stop by and say, I just had to come see what that plant was because it was so beautiful to see the blooms when I was walking by on the sidewalk. Or you can have something like this where you have this gorgeous haven of a backyard and you have an area that's all set off to itself and it's filled with life because it's filled with native plants. And there happens to be windows that look out onto that space, and the person always enjoys seeing the nest building going on right there where there's a good feed for the kids, just like with those teenagers. You want those baby birds to get their food fast because they're going to be cheeping at you. We all know that when the 2-year-old is like, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. So even in a small space, you can still make a big difference. It doesn't have to be acreage. And then for the 10th step, this is actually the advice from Dr. Talamy. And what he tells us to do is take 10 steps back. If you can't stand to look at something like this and feel like that's a good thing, take 10 steps back and you won't even notice it. If you think that the galls that form on different things are too ugly to deal with and you need to spray them and kill whatever it is, take 10 steps back. If the holes in the tree annoy you, take 10 steps to the other side because they probably didn't make them all the way around. They probably only made it on the side that's least exposed. So Think about all the creatures that you wouldn't see if you were 10 steps back. Would you see these little guys that hide out in the grasses? Or would you see this little tiny caterpillar that disguises himself with little pieces of the petals? Would you see this longhorn bee that's deep down into that purple poppy mallow blossom? Would you see how much pollen this guy has? And then over here is, because it's behind the little deal, I believe that's the little thin blade of grass that has one of these caterpillars crawling away and going somewhere else, still disguised as though he's on the Rudbeckia, which, you know, what were you thinking, guy? But would you notice this big fat bumblebee if you were 10 steps away? It's just that we really don't see these things until we start paying attention. And when we start to focus on it, then we can think about, oh yeah, these guys all have a purpose. And look at that wasp. Is that not the coolest thing? There's also a really cool blue wasp that loves this mint also. And I can never get a really good photograph of it just because it's so iridescent that the light never really truly shows how blue it is. It's gorgeous. And look at how skinny that little waist is. Who needs a corset when you've got a waist like that, right? And this is one of the very many reasons that I think native plants are important, is we want to have our kids be engaged with nature much more so than a screen. And we want to know that if they steal all the berries out of the bucket, well, those blackberries did not have any kind of chemical sprayed on them, not only because of the humans, but also because of the insects, because we can share when we have a wealth of plant material. We can share with all of the other insects, all the birds, even the squirrels that I did not say a 4-letter word about. But we can share, we can have enough to share, and we can have a safe place that we don't have to worry about our animals or our children or anybody else that we love and care about being in that space. I mean, look at this. Horticulture Magazine is going mainstream media with having monarchs and why native plants are important in our gardens. Even Horticulture Magazine. I mean, this is the people that used to tell us the only way you could have something was with tulips and boxwoods and, you know, maybe a butterfly bush thrown in for good measure. But it's something that's being recognized. It's not just, you know, us hippie liberal weirdos over in the corner anymore. It's people are really beginning to understand that it's important to provide a home for all these creatures, not only the monarchs, but also the monarchs. I mean, would you see this guy if you were 10 steps away? I don't think so. This one was one that they always flutter up when I mow in the evening, and I hate that because it makes me think of how many of them am I chopping up. Would you notice this nibbling on these leaves? Would you notice this leaf that was all rolled up and inside you would find a caterpillar that looks like that on your spice bush? Would you notice that if you were 10 steps back? So maybe we can just give ourselves a little bit of space, take the time to change our ways a little bit and get a different perspective on how we do things and why we do things differently. This is a slide that Dr. Talamy had used when, let's see, it was at Forest Keeling, golly, was that 2 years ago maybe, when they did a really cool spring festival kind of a thing before COVID came around. And this is exactly what we need to do with our 10 steps, is give ourselves the freedom to, yes, save the monarchs, yes, provide for the monarchs, but also for all those other creatures that are still suffering in our ecosystem because of the way that we've been gardening for such a long time now and that we continue to do. So if we can convince ourselves and then maybe one other person, and then they convince one other person, it's like that old Chiclets commercial that had all the little twins making the chewing gum thing. Anyway, you know what I mean. Be mindful of how we do things. Think about the fact that yes, monarchs are so important, but we also have so many other creatures that need us to give them the right home, the right food, and not poison them and be afraid of them because they're different than what we expected to see when we planted a native plant, thinking that we were planting for the monarchs or the butterflies. These other creatures need a home too, and they're not aggressive. If you spent even close to as many hours in and amongst these plants as I do, and have never been stung, have never been bitten by something, okay, mosquitoes, yes, but not like a furry animal kind of thing. It's okay to welcome these things into our spaces. So support Grow Native. If you're in the Kansas City area, you might want to also check out the Deep Roots KC program, which is really nice. And now if you have any questions, we'll see what we can do.
Thank you very much, Paula. This is Carol David, Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation and the Grow Native program. And we have some comments, and there's one question here. If others of you have questions, please put those in the Q&A and I will direct them to Paula. There's one comment here about aphids that's interesting from James. He says the yellow aphids on milkweeds are not native. One may feel okay about squirting them off with water when they abound on milkweeds. Little pale green or dark gray aphids are native. So that's good information to have.
Indeed.
Becky asks, do you leave some leaves in your beds all year round?
Yes, I leave all of the leaves in my beds all year round. Actually, I leave all of the leaves everywhere until it's time that I am forced to do the first mowing in the springtime, and then the ones that are on the grass get mowed and the rest of them still stay where they are. If there's an area that seems like things are not coming up through it, then sometimes I'll put on my boots and kind of walk around and fluff them up a little bit with my feet, but I don't ever take the leaves and remove them and put them somewhere else.
Thank you, Paula. There's a question about where's the best place to get milkweed, and I'll just you can go to the Grow Native website, grownative.org, and click on the resource guide. And you will find lists of suppliers of native plants like milkweed, native seeds, landscape designers or landscape architects, land care professionals. And there's also on that main page, a main resource guide page, you can find a map to retailers. So you might be able to find a retailer near you, but many of the professional members, they do ship plants as well.
Mm-hmm. Carol, you might add, just as an additional little tidbit, sometimes Monarch Watch, which is a partner with Grow Native, has some of that information on their website as well. Monarch Watch at KU, and I think it's .org, but Kansas University Monarch Watch program oftentimes does have that available too.
Thank you. And the other thing I would mention is milkweed is in high demand, and before you venture out to a nursery or garden center, you might call first and see if they have any in stock as well. Great. And as a question, what's the best way to get rid of winter creeper ground cover?
Go back to the 70s and tell them not to do it. It's vicious in my experience. What I typically, and it depends on how thick it is, if it started going up a tree, that thing can be 6 inches around. So it really depends on it, but a lot of times I have to use chemical to eradicate it. And typically that'll be cut the stem at whatever portion. If it's one that's going up a tree and it's particularly thick, just cut like a 6-inch chunk out of that and then paint both of those ends of that root system. Yeah, it's a difficult one to get rid of. It really is.
Thank you. Are grass clippings okay to use as mulch?
Well, it all depends on what your grass clippings might contain. They can sometimes become much more compacted than leaves do. So yes, they do, but you want to be a little bit cautious and perhaps even start a compost heap and let them cook down a little bit and then use the compost for it. It just kind of depends on how thick it's going to be, how wet they are when they go on. You know, they can compact into a pretty strong chunk. If you've ever tried to clean below the bottom deck of your mower, you know how much they can really become compacted into a gunky mess. So yeah, they can, just with caution.
Thank you. Another question about poison ivy. How do you handle it? Or do you handle it?
My husband, luckily, is not allergic to poison ivy. We do have a hedgerow that is filled with poison ivy. Poison ivy is actually a really beneficial native plant. That being said, I can't have it out in the spaces where I am because I'm really allergic to it. One of my sons is super allergic to it. So yeah, I have to use either my husband there to pull it up by the root. Otherwise, I have to use a paintbrush and some Roundup and kill it. But I don't get it on other stuff, just on the poison ivy.
Thanks, Paula. I might add too that if you do have poison ivy, but it's not in your immediate area and you're not terribly allergic to it, like if it's growing up in a tree, but it's not interfering with your, daily traffic, you might leave it because the fruits are, as Paula said, they're real beneficial and nutritious for birds. But of course, that depends on, your situation.
Right. I also make sure that I have jewel weed growing in my yard because that always is really nice for rubbing on any area that was exposed to the poison ivy oils and really soothing for it. Oftentimes it'll just heal it up.
Do you have any?
Not as a medical reference or anything like that. Just that's one thing I personally do. So
thank you. Do you have any advice about managing mosquitoes in native gardens?
Yes, actually I do. And again, this comes from Dr. Talamy. He had recommended creating a mosquito trap. And I tried it last year and it worked really well. And in fact, I started putting it together again this morning. I have a really large flower pot. It's one of those plasticky ones. It does not have drainage holes in it. And so I put some water in there and a little bale of the barley straw that they use for, if you have like a little ornamental pond, you can put barley straw, little floaty thingies in there that help to keep the water clear, and a BT dunk. You have to be careful when you read the packaging on the dunks because some of them are BT and some of them are not, but BT basically prevents the larvae of the mosquitoes from becoming adults. And Dr. Talamy had recommended this methodology and we tried it last summer and it worked great for us. So you have your big old vat of water and you could do it with a 5-gallon bucket or a pail or whatever it is, depending upon the size of area you want to protect. But so the mosquitoes go and lay their eggs in there and then those eggs never develop into adults. So they're not going to come out and get you.
Thank you, Paula. Do you have any advice about redirecting carpenter bees? They are drilling holes in the porch overhang. Love having them around, but prefer they drill into something other than our house.
A couple of different things you can do. One is make sure your surface is painted and or treated wood because typically they're not going to go into those. And also make sure there is some dead wood somewhere nearby that they can get into, not necessarily touching your house or your foundation or anything like that. But if they have a place where they can create a home, they're not going to necessarily think your home is the easiest spot to do that. So give them an option.
Thank you. Another question, can you suggest a resource in which a person could come to your property and make suggestions for native plants based on your sun or shade areas?
As Carol had mentioned before, the Grow Native Resource Guide lists all different kinds of people who do that. And the Grow Native website has terrific information as far as lists of plants for certain different types of environmental considerations, such as sunshade, wet or dry, as well as attracting this or that or the other fauna to the flora.
Thanks, Paula. And I'll just add, if this person or anybody else is in the St. Louis area, there's the St. Louis Audubon has a program called Bring Nature Home, where Bringing Conservation Home, excuse me, where volunteers will come for a modest fee and assess your yard and help with those kinds of things, help recommend, you know, invasives to remove, natives to plant. So that's another resource if you're in the St. Louis area. But if you're not in the St. Louis area, like Paula said, we do have top 10 lists for sun and shade and many other growing conditions that can be a starting point. Also, the native plant database is got more than 300 plant species, and it's searchable, and it has many useful filters. So you can select on sun or shade or dry or wet soil or many other things, and create lists for yourself as well. Another question, does pokeweed take over a garden?
I would have to say it depends on your garden. If you have an area where you can allow it to grow, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, and the birds love it. And honestly, it does reseed, but I have a lot of other things that reseed much more aggressively than the pokeweed does in my yard. So I can't, you know, if it's a bed and all you have is beds that are open space with mulch in between or bare dirt in between, yeah, Mother Nature is going to fill that space. But in general, there are many, many much more aggressive different types of plants than the pokeweed is.
Thank you. Are there any kinds of plants I could grow that could help deter honeysuckle?
No. I don't know of a way for that to work.
All right, that's honest.
I mean, if it were not something that would eradicate other plants around it, then it would not be as invasive and as problematic as it is. I mean, obviously, when it gets going, it blocks out all the other plants. So I don't know of a way to keep it from propagating itself somewhere.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for lawn or grass alternatives for kids to play and run around on that can survive being under leaves over the winter?
Well, my own yard gets pretty heavy traffic from 2 large dogs and as many people as come through, and you know, family gatherings and such. I have some fescue, I have clover, and that is not a native plant, but I do have it in my lawn because it just happens there and I don't care to prevent it. Dandelions, wild strawberry, plantain, all the things that have that big scarlet letter W on them are tough enough to handle it if it's not a monoculture. So give a mixture of things a try. It's going to depend on any specific site. I mean, you know, like with clover and wild strawberries, things as a kid that you might have gotten stung because you stepped on a bee that was on a flower. Well, yeah, they're gonna sting you if you step on them, but wear shoes. You know, you don't have to wear them all the time. Yes, going barefoot is good, but don't look for a monoculture that can survive every type of everything that goes on in an entire year of Missouri weather and human contact. That's my best advice, is just mix it up. Don't settle for just one plant.
Thank you. There's a question, what is your opinion about tropical milkweed?
That's a very loaded question if someone follows monarch things. My own very personal opinion, this is nothing that has any scientific value to it as far as what it does or doesn't do for disease within the monarch population. My own opinion is we have so many different kinds of milkweed here in Missouri that are happily native here. They want to grow here. They cannot ever become a problem because they belong here. If you're going to use it, put it in a pot, put it away in the wintertime if you're going to overwinter it. But I don't personally use it just because I don't see the need. I have all these other things that I can use. So why would I use that one that might possibly be problematic?
Thank you. There was a question about, is there a book that is particular to the lower Midwest for plants? And I'll just add that I'm not sure I know of one specifically for the lower Midwest, but there's a wonderful compendium of 500 native plants for the Midwest written by Alan Branhagen. And then he has kind of a condensed, sort of slimmed down version of that book that I think has maybe 250 plants. And you can read about those books at the GardeNerd.org website under the tab Learn. We have a page on publications, and there are a number of other publications there. There's a book on native shrubs in the Midwest. And for the books that we actually sell, there'll be a link to our gift shop, and you can, if you choose to purchase them through the Grow Native MPF, then those sale proceeds do help fund our work. But Paula, perhaps you have other suggestions as well.
Well, one of my very favorites is, does this show the Pollinator Victory Garden by Kim Eierman? When was it? Anyway, she's got, I'll kind of flip through it here if I can. She's got, plants and the insects. So it's a really nice one. And then of course there are always Dr. Talamy's books. His newest is The Nature of Oaks, because oaks are the #1 supporter of the most varieties of insects, Lepidoptera specifically, of any of the plants that we have.
Thank you. Maybe there's one other question. There's a comment from James that while in regard to honeysuckle, of course, you can try to, you can control it with herbicides, or you can help reduce it by using herbicides, but you can also, burning does help suppress it, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. I don't see any other questions. Anything else you wanted to add, Paula, before we sign off?
Just don't stress out over native plant gardening. They don't baby them too much, because then they'll get to different sizes than they're supposed to, and just enjoy it. Watch all the creatures that come around. It truly is addictive.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paula, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Tomorrow, Brooke will send out a link to the recording of Paula's presentation, along with some links to some of the resources that we've mentioned today. And we will continue with webinars and master classes over the summer. For June through August, we're going to drop down to 2 a month rather than 4 a month. But do tune in. We've got some great presentations, and you can look for information and registration information that'll be available soon on the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native websites. So thanks again so much, Paula, for a wonderful presentation, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We also do have we'll have more plant sales in September. So happy gardening and happy observing all of the wonderful creatures in your gardens that Paula talked about today. Thanks again.